Good day. Today is Thursday, December 12th, 2025. And before I begin this program, let me remind you to tick the like button if you've found what you've heard useful and want to indicate that fact. Today's program is going to focus almost entirely on what I consider to be one of the most significant financial and geopolitical crises currently unfolding in Europe. And that is the complete breakdown of the European Union's plan to use 140 billion euros in frozen Russian assets to provide long-term funding for Ukraine. To understand the magnitude of what's happening here, we need to appreciate that this represents the largest attempt at asset confiscation in modern financial history. The frozen Russian assets in question were accumulated over decades of legitimate trade and investment relationships. These aren't assets that were obtained through criminal activity. They represent central bank reserves, sovereign wealth fund holdings, and private investments that were frozen as part of the sanctions regime implemented after February 2022. The legal precedent being established here could fundamentally alter how sovereign states view the safety of holding reserves in Western financial centers. Now, this crisis has been developing for weeks, but what makes it particularly fascinating is how it exposes the fundamental contradictions at the heart of the European Union's approach to both international law and financial sovereignty. What we're witnessing is essentially a collision between political ambition and financial reality, between legal theory and practical implementation. And I'm going to explain why this matters far more than most people realize, because the implications stretch far beyond Europe's borders and could fundamentally reshape how international finance operates in the 21st century. The centerpiece of this crisis is Belgium's fierce resistance to the scheme, led by Bart De Wever. Now, De Wever is not some random political figure. He's the leader of the New Flemish Alliance and a key figure in Belgian politics who has consistently opposed what he sees as Brussels' overreach. But his opposition to this particular scheme goes much deeper than political posturing. De Wever has a background in law and understands precisely the legal quicksand that Brussels is asking Belgium to step into. His party represents Flemish interests, and Flanders is home to many of the financial institutions that would bear the ultimate liability if this scheme goes wrong. What De Wever is demanding is something that should be obvious to anyone familiar with financial risk management. If other European countries want Belgium to guarantee 140 billion euros using assets deposited in Belgian institutions, then those countries must share the legal and financial liability. The fact that this request is being rejected tells us everything we need to know about how confident other European governments actually are in the legal foundation of this scheme. Belgium's position is particularly complex because of its role as host to both EU institutions and Euroclear, the securities settlement system that holds a significant portion of the frozen Russian assets. Euroclear Belgium alone holds approximately 190 billion euros in frozen Russian securities, making it the single largest repository of these assets globally. This puts Belgium in an impossible position. Brussels is essentially asking them to weaponize their own financial infrastructure while bearing all the legal consequences if courts later rule that the asset seizure was illegal. The Belgian government is acutely aware that international arbitration courts could eventually award massive damages against them personally, not against the European Union as a whole. And here's where this gets really interesting. The European Commission, led by Ursula von der Leyen, is pushing this scheme precisely because every alternative would require European taxpayers to directly fund Ukraine's massive budget deficit. Ukraine is currently burning through approximately 3 billion euros per month just to keep its government functioning. That's separate from military spending, which is additional billions. To put this in perspective, Ukraine's monthly burn rate exceeds the entire annual defense budgets of most European countries. It's worth noting that both S&P and Fitch rating agencies have stated that while the loan arrangement poses minimal risks to most EU member states' sovereign ratings, for Belgium specifically, guaranteeing 140 billion euros would represent approximately 22 to 23% of GDP. That's an exposure that would be considered reckless by any reasonable financial standard. Now, I want to pause here because the numbers involved are staggering. Ukraine's total financing needs over the next 2 years are estimated at 360 billion euros by The Economist magazine. That's more than twice the size of the proposed Russian assets loan. So even if this 140 billion euro scheme were to succeed, it would only cover a fraction of Ukraine's requirements. What makes these numbers even more concerning is the lack of transparency around how this money is actually being spent. While military expenditures are obviously necessary during wartime, there are persistent questions about procurement processes, administrative costs, and the efficiency of fund allocation. The European Court of Auditors has already raised concerns about the ability to properly track European financial assistance to Ukraine, noting significant gaps in oversight mechanisms. This opacity makes it even more difficult for countries like Belgium to justify taking on massive financial exposure for what amounts to a blank check arrangement. But let's return to Belgium's objections because they reveal something crucial about how this entire enterprise was conceived. Belgium is essentially saying, if this scheme is so legally sound and risk-free as you claim, why won't France, Luxembourg, and other countries that hold Russian assets participate? France holds approximately 19 billion euros in frozen Russian funds, Luxembourg about 10 billion euros, but both have remained conspicuously silent about joining the mechanism. This exposes what I can only describe as the hypocrisy at the heart of the scheme. Other European countries are demanding that Belgium take all the risks while they free ride on the benefits. It's a classic example of what economists call a collective action problem, where everyone wants the benefits but nobody wants to bear the costs. What makes this even more revealing is that countries like Germany and the Netherlands, which have been among the most vocal supporters of the scheme, have structured their own frozen Russian asset holdings in ways that minimize their direct exposure. They're essentially asking Belgium to do what they themselves have been careful to avoid. The timeline pressure adds another layer of urgency to this crisis. Without a resolution by early 2026, Ukraine could face a liquidity crisis that would force it to choose between funding its military operations or maintaining basic government services. The International Monetary Fund has indicated that its own $8.2 billion program for Ukraine depends on evidence of long-term financial viability, which requires the EU mechanism that Belgium continues to block. Now, here's what I find particularly revealing about Europe's strategic predicament. The Commission has explored alternative funding mechanisms, including joint EU debt issuance or bilateral loans from member states. But these alternatives would require immediate debt servicing costs and would place an even greater strain on national budgets that are already stretched to their limits. The political dynamics around these alternatives are fascinating to observe. Joint EU debt, or Eurobonds as they're sometimes called, would require unanimous agreement from member states and would effectively mean that fiscally responsible countries like Germany and the Netherlands would be underwriting the debts of others. We saw during the European debt crisis how toxic this concept can be domestically. German taxpayers, for instance, have consistently opposed any mechanism that would make them liable for other countries' fiscal decisions. The fact that this Ukrainian funding crisis is forcing EU officials to revisit these previously rejected mechanisms shows just how desperate the situation has become. This explains von der Leyen's apparent desperation to push ahead with the Russian asset scheme despite Belgium's objections. From Brussels' perspective, there simply isn't a viable alternative that doesn't require European taxpayers to directly fund Ukraine's budget deficit, and the political impossibility of this option in most European countries makes the Russian assets appear to be the only game in town. But De Wever's most recent argument introduces an entirely new dimension to the crisis. He's essentially arguing that confiscating Russian assets would eliminate any incentive for Moscow to negotiate, thereby prolonging the conflict indefinitely. This perspective suggests that the short-term financial relief for Ukraine could come at the cost of long-term resolution of the crisis. And this brings us to the heart of what this crisis is really about. It's not just about money. It's about the fundamental question of whether sovereign states can simply decide to confiscate the assets of other sovereign states based on political disagreements. The precedent being set here would apply not just to Russia, but to any country that finds itself in dispute with the West. Think about what message this sends to countries like China, India, or the Gulf states that hold significant assets in European financial centers. If the EU can simply decide to confiscate Russian assets today, what's to stop them from targeting Chinese assets tomorrow if tensions escalate over Taiwan, or Indian assets if New Delhi refuses to align with Western sanctions policies? This concern isn't theoretical. We're already seeing concrete evidence of capital flight from European financial centers. Switzerland, interestingly, has been one of the beneficiaries of this trend, as its traditional neutrality makes it appear more trustworthy than EU jurisdictions that have demonstrated their willingness to weaponize finance. This is why the reaction from central banks around the world has been so telling. There are reports that several non-Western central banks have begun quietly diversifying their reserves away from euros and moving assets out of European jurisdictions. This isn't just about Russia, it's about the fundamental trustworthiness of the European financial system as a safe haven for international reserves. The diplomatic fallout from this crisis is already becoming apparent. Countries that have traditionally maintained balanced relationships with both Russia and the West are being forced to recalculate their financial strategies. The Gulf states, for example, have been notably quiet about this asset seizure proposal, despite their generally good relationships with European powers. India's reaction has been particularly telling. New Delhi has been accelerating its efforts to develop alternative payment systems and reducing its exposure to Western financial institutions. Even allies like Japan have expressed private concerns about the precedent being set, though they've been diplomatically restrained in their public statements. The legal implications are equally problematic. While the EU has constructed elaborate justifications for why this asset seizure is supposedly legal, the reality is that it represents a fundamental departure from established principles of international law regarding sovereign immunity and property rights. Belgium's resistance isn't just about financial risk. It's about the recognition that this scheme could fundamentally undermine the rule of law on which international financial systems depend. If law can be rewritten based on political convenience, then no assets are truly safe and no legal commitments are truly binding. What makes this particularly ironic is that this crisis comes at precisely the moment when the United States appears to be stepping back from its unconditional support for Ukraine. The failure of the Trump-Putin Alaska summit, which I've discussed in previous programs, has left Europe essentially holding the bag for Ukraine's financial needs. The timing of this crisis couldn't be worse for transatlantic coordination. The Americans were supposed to be partners in this endeavor, but their own domestic political constraints and economic challenges mean they cannot provide the kind of massive long-term financial commitments that Ukraine requires. President Trump's team has made it clear that they expect Europe to take primary responsibility for Ukrainian funding, while the US focuses on other priorities. This shift in American policy has caught European leaders off guard and left them scrambling to fill a financial gap that may be simply too large to manage without serious consequences for their own economies. The irony is that Europe is being asked to take unprecedented financial risks precisely at the moment when American security guarantees appear less reliable than they have been in decades. And here's where the numbers become truly sobering. Even if Europe could somehow mobilize 140 billion euros through this Russian asset scheme, and even if they could find additional billions through other mechanisms, Ukraine's total needs over the next several years could exceed €500 billion. That's a sum that would strain even the entire European Union's budget capacity. The geopolitical implications extend well beyond Ukraine's immediate financing needs. The breakdown of this scheme would represent a massive failure for von der Leyen's Commission and could trigger a broader crisis of confidence in European Union financial mechanisms. Moreover, the precedent of asset confiscation, if it proceeds despite legal challenges, could fundamentally alter how international finance operates. Countries and institutions would need to factor in political risk when deciding where to hold reserves, potentially fragmenting the global financial system along geopolitical lines. This fragmentation is already beginning to happen. We're seeing the emergence of alternative payment systems, alternative reserve currencies, and alternative financial centers that explicitly position themselves as alternatives to Western-dominated institutions. The Belgian resistance to this scheme may therefore represent more than just one country's objection to a particular financial arrangement. It may represent a recognition that the West's ability to weaponize the international financial system has reached its limits, and that further escalation could damage Western financial interests more than it harms their intended targets. As I finish this analysis, it's worth noting that this crisis is unfolding against the backdrop of broader European economic challenges. Germany, Europe's largest economy, is facing its own fiscal constraints and industrial decline, with some sectors experiencing what can only be described as deindustrialization. France is dealing with massive debt burdens and political instability that make long-term financial commitments increasingly difficult to sustain. Italy's debt to GDP ratio continues to hover at concerning levels, and even traditionally stable economies like the Netherlands are feeling the strain of increased defense spending and energy costs. The idea that these countries can somehow conjure hundreds of billions of euros for Ukraine while managing their own economic challenges seems increasingly unrealistic. This economic context makes Belgium's resistance appear not just prudent, but perhaps inevitable. The resolution of this crisis will tell us a great deal about the future direction of European integration, the relationship between European law and political expediency, and the sustainability of the West's approach to the Ukrainian conflict. Belgium's resistance may ultimately force Europe to confront some uncomfortable truths about the limits of financial power and the unintended consequences of weaponizing economic relationships. Well, this is where I'm going to finish today's analysis. The situation continues to develop rapidly, and I suspect we'll see significant developments in the coming days. As always, you can find all our programs on our various platforms. Don't forget to check out our shop, and please remember to tick the like button if you've found this analysis useful. More from me soon. Have a very good day.